All right, diving in today, folks. We're going deep, really deep into some serious philosophical waters.
Deep waters is right.
We're talking about the moral philosophies of two giants, two absolute titans of thought,
Yeah, two of the biggest names in the game,
Kant and Hume.
of course.
Specifically, we're looking at their very different ideas about morality, where it comes from, what it means.
And how those ideas still reverberate today, still shape the way we think about right and wrong, good and bad.
Our guide for this intellectual journey, the incredibly detailed Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry, Kant and Hume on morality.
The dense read.
Super dense, and we're going to try to distill it for you, give you those key insights, those aha moments.
Right, without getting lost in the jargon.
But fair warning, this is still a deep dive for folks who are already interested in philosophy, who are familiar with the basics of Kant and Hume.
So if you're looking for Philosophy 101, this might not be the episode for you.
We're assuming you've at least dipped your toes into these waters before, ready to go a little deeper. Now, the relationship between Kant and Hume is fascinating.
It really is.
Kant himself famously said that Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumber
Right, like Hume shook him out of his comfortable assumptions.
and forced him to confront some really tough questions about knowledge, about the limits of reason.
And that had a huge impact on Kant's entire philosophical system.
But while their debates about metaphysics and epistemology are legendary, their disagreements about morality are just as profound.
And those disagreements have had a lasting impact, shaping philosophical ethics for centuries.
So that's what we're focusing on today, those fundamental disagreements.
The Clash of the Titans, Kant versus Hume, round two.
Round two, exactly.
But we also want to highlight some of the surprising connections, some of the shared assumptions, and even some areas where Kant was influenced by Hume and the broader sentimentalist tradition.
Because it wasn't all just opposition and disagreement.
There's a lot more nuance to their relationship than that.
To give you a roadmap to navigate this complex terrain, we'll start with their core ideas about morality.
What they considered to be the subject matter, the fundamental questions of ethics.
Right. Then we'll trace the evolution of Kant's relationship with Hume and British moral philosophy from early influences to later critiques.
We'll see how Kant's thinking changed, how he grappled with Hume's ideas.
Then we'll dive into their contrasting views on the role of reason and emotion in morality, both in judging actions and in motivating us to act.
Two very different perspectives on the interplay of head and heart.
From there, we'll explore their distinct understandings of virtue and vice, what makes a person good or bad.
Their catalogs of virtues and vices are really fascinating.
They are, and they reveal a lot about their underlying philosophical assumptions.
Then we'll tackle the thorny issue of freedom and necessity, how they each reconciled the need for moral responsibility with the idea of a deterministic universe.
Yeah, that's a head-scratcher for sure.
It is, but a crucial one for understanding their views on morality.
And finally, we'll wrap things up with their thoughts on the relationship between religion and morality.
Always a hot topic. So let's jump right into those core ideas about morality.
Let's do it.
Now, one of the most striking things about Kant's moral philosophy is his central focus on law, duty, and obligation.
Like, those are the building blocks of his entire ethical system.
Exactly. He sees those concepts as the very bedrock of morality. Like the moral universe is built on these unbreakable rules and obligations.
And he's very much in line with that kind of thinking, that there are these absolute, universally binding moral principles.
Like Bernard Williams' concept of a moral system, where there are certain obligations that bind us unconditionally.
So for Kant, it's all about figuring out what those duties are, what that moral law requires of us.
And the key question for him always revolves around those duties imposed by a uniquely moral necessity.
It's like morality has its own kind of gravity, its own force that compels us.
A moral imperative.
Exactly. And virtue, for Kant, flows directly from those core concepts.
It's about aligning yourself with the moral law, having the strength of will to do your duty, even when it's difficult.
So it's a very rule-based, principle-driven approach.
Very much so.
Now, Hume comes at this from a completely different angle.
Oh yeah, he throws the rule book right out the window.
Well, not exactly, but he definitely shifts the focus.
He does. For Hume, it's all about personal merit.
What makes a person worthy of admiration, of respect?
Exactly. He's far more interested in the motives behind our actions, the inner qualities that drive us to do good or bad.
And how do we even recognize those virtuous motives?
For Hume, the key lies in the approval of our fellow human beings, the responses of those around us.
So it's a much more social, relational understanding of morality.
Absolutely. He believes that we naturally respond to certain traits and actions with approval or disapproval, and that these responses, over time, shape our understanding of what is virtuous.
But it's not just any random person's opinion that matters.
Right. Hume is very specific about this. He says we need to consider the perspective of what he calls a judicious spectator,
Someone who's observing with a clear, unbiased eye.
someone who's informed, impartial, and can see the bigger picture.
And what kind of traits does this judicious spectator tend to approve of?
Hume emphasizes traits that are either useful or immediately agreeable.
So things that benefit society or simply bring pleasure?
Exactly. And duty and obligation, in Hume's view, emerge from these responses.
It's not that we have some pre-existing duty to be kind. It's that kindness naturally elicits approval, and that sense of approval reinforces the behavior.
So duty and obligation are kind of downstream from those initial feelings of approval.
It's a very different way of thinking about it than Kant.
Absolutely. A fundamental difference in perspective.
Kant starts with the rules, with the moral law, and virtue follows from that.
Hume looks at what we admire, what we naturally approve of, and that shapes our sense of duty.
And this difference leads to very different ideas about what even constitutes the domain of morality, where those moral boundaries lie.
Right. Kant draws a very sharp line between the moral realm and other areas of life.
Like prudence, politics, aesthetics.
He's very insistent on this separation. Morality has its own unique set of standards, its own demands.
Like it operates on a different level.
Exactly. It's not about what's expedient or aesthetically pleasing. It's about what's right in this absolute universal sense.
And Hume takes a much more holistic view.
Much more fluid. He sees a lot more overlap between the moral and the non-moral.
He even compares moral judgment to our sense of taste.
Like how we appreciate beauty or find something disgusting.
And he questions whether this sharp separation of moral virtues from other personal qualities is really justified.
He points out that ancient ethics didn't make such a clear distinction
It's like we've imposed this artificial boundary, maybe influenced by Christian thought.
and lost sight of the interconnectedness of all aspects of human life.
And this difference in how they define morality also plays into their views on its significance, its status.
Right, Kant imbues morality with this unique dignity.
Like it has an inherent value, a special kind of worth.
Exactly, and this dignity extends to the rational being, the individual who possesses an autonomous will.
That capacity for self-determination, for choosing our own path.
And this dignity demands respect, a particular kind of reverence, an acknowledgement of the inherent worth of the individual.
So moral concern, for Kant, is all about upholding this dignity, respecting that autonomy, never treating individuals as mere means to an end.
Like, they're not just tools to be used, they have their own intrinsic value.
It's this profound respect for personhood that drives his whole ethical system.
Now, Hume doesn't see morality as having this kind of special status.
It's much more integrated into the fabric of everyday life.
It's part of the human experience, not something separate or elevated.
And while he certainly values virtue, he doesn't think it requires this unique form of respect that Kant talks about.
For Hume, the principles of morality arise from the same basic human tendencies, ideas, and passions that drive all our other behavior.
It's all part of the same natural order.
And pleasure and utility, for Hume, play a much bigger role in shaping our moral sensibilities.
So even at this fundamental level, they have very different conceptions of what morality is all about, where it comes from.
But they do agree on one important point.
What's that?
They both reject religion as the foundation of morality.
And they also reject the idea of some set of objective moral facts existing independently of us.
Like there's no moral law written into the fabric of the universe waiting to be discovered.
So where did they locate that foundation, if not in God or some eternal moral code?
Well, Hume firmly grounds morality in human nature, specifically in our emotional responses to the world around us.
It's those feelings of approval and disapproval, those gut reactions that shape our moral sense.
Exactly. Morality, for Hume, is ultimately a product of our social and emotional nature.
And Kant takes a very different approach.
He grounds morality in the autonomy of the rational will.
That ability to choose our actions, to act independently of our desires and inclinations.
And that autonomy is tied to reason, to our ability to understand and follow the moral law.
So morality, for Kant, is rooted in our capacity for rational self-governance.
It's about acting in accordance with principles, not just following our feelings.
And this difference in their views on the foundation of morality is reflected in their philosophical methods.
Oh yeah, their approaches to investigating morality are as different as night and day.
Hume is all about observation, about empirical evidence, about studying human behavior in the real world.
He takes this naturalistic empirical approach, what he calls an experimental method.
Like he's treating morality as a natural phenomenon to be studied, like the weather or the movement of the planets.
Exactly. He wants to understand the causes and effects of moral behavior, the psychological and social factors that shape our moral sensibilities,
And he even compares humans to animals.
to see what we can learn about the origins of morality from our shared evolutionary history.
So it's very much a bottom-up approach, starting with observation and working towards general principles.
And Kant completely rejects that method for the fundamental principles of morality.
He insists on an a priori investigation.
Using pure reason, independent of any particular experience.
Like, he's trying to uncover the logical structure of morality, the universal principles that must hold true in any possible world.
And his argument is that empirical approaches can only tell us what people actually do, not what they ought to do.
Like, you can observe 1,000 acts of kindness, but that doesn't tell you why kindness is good, why it's morally obligatory.
So for Kant, the foundation of morality must be discovered through reason, through a rigorous analysis of the very concept of moral obligation.
But even Kant acknowledges that once you've established those fundamental principles, you still need to apply them to the real world.
And that's where an understanding of human nature comes in.
So he's not completely dismissive of the insights of empirical psychology.
No, he recognizes the importance of understanding human motivations, emotions, and the social context of our actions.
And it's here that we see the influence of Hume and the sentimentalist tradition on Kant's thinking.
Which is really interesting because Kant is so often presented as this staunch opponent of sentimentalism.
Right, he's famous for his critique of moral sense theories.
But it's a more complex story than that.
It is, in fact. Kant's early ethical writings show a clear engagement with sentimentalist ideas.
He was definitely influenced by thinkers like Francis Hutcheson, who emphasized the role of moral feelings in our ethical judgments.
And there's evidence that Hume's work also had an impact on Kant's thinking about human nature.
So let's trace the evolution of that relationship, from early influences to later critiques.
Okay, so where do we start?
Well, one of Kant's early works, Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and Sublime, from 1764, provides some clues.
In that work, he analyzes the feelings that people have towards different character traits.
And he suggests that moral principles are not just abstract rules, but are connected to a consciousness of a feeling.
Like, we have a certain feeling towards those who exhibit virtuous traits, a feeling that goes beyond mere sympathy,
He even talks about the feeling of the beauty and the dignity of human nature.
which sounds very much in line with the sentimentalist emphasis on moral feelings.
It does, and it's not the only example.
Yeah. His inquiry concerning the distinctness of the principles of natural theology and morality from 1763 also points in that direction.
In that work, he makes a distinction between our faculty for discerning truth, which is reason, and our faculty for experiencing the good, which he explicitly links to feeling.
And he even talks about an unanalyzable feeling of the good.
Which sounds a lot like Hume's notion of a peculiar sentiment of approval, that distinctive feeling that we get when we contemplate a virtuous action.
So it seems like Kant was initially quite open to the idea of feelings playing a central role in morality.
He was, and his lectures from that period confirm this.
In his lecture announcements from the mid-1760s, he explicitly states his belief that the distinction between good and evil, the judgment of moral rightness, can be known through sentiment.
Without needing any complex philosophical proofs.
Like it's something we can grasp intuitively through our feelings.
And he even indicates his intention to further develop the ideas of Shaftesbury, Hutcheson, and Hume, acknowledging their contributions to understanding morality.
So he clearly saw value in their work, even if he didn't fully agree with everything they said.
But then something shifted.
What happened?
By the late 1760s, Kant became increasingly convinced that sentimentalism just couldn't account for the unconditional nature of moral obligation.
Like it didn't provide a strong enough foundation for those absolute, universally binding moral principles that he believed in.
Exactly. He argued that morality makes demands on us, demands that are not contingent on our feelings or desires.
They're categorical, they apply regardless of our circumstances or inclination.
And he felt that grounding morality in feeling just couldn't capture that sense of necessity, that absolute authority of the moral law.
So he started to see sentimentalism as fundamentally inadequate.
And this led him to develop his own critical moral philosophy, with its emphasis on reason and autonomy.
And he became quite critical of those heteronymous theories, those that locate the source of morality outside the individual's own rational will.
including sentimentalism and any other theory that grounds morality in feelings or external influences.
So his main objection was that sentimentalism couldn't provide a universal and necessary foundation for morality.
Exactly. He pointed out that feelings vary from person to person, from culture to culture.
And even if everyone agreed on what was morally good, that agreement would still be a contingent fact about human psychology, not a reflection of some absolute moral truth.
He even used a thought experiment to illustrate this point, imagining a world where God had designed us to feel pleasure from vice and pain from virtue.
Which would completely undermine any attempt to ground morality in our feelings.
It would. It would make morality completely arbitrary, dependent on the whims of our creator.
So, for Kant, only an a priori grounding based on reason could provide the kind of universal and necessary foundation that morality requires.
But even after this decisive intellectual break, even after developing his own critical moral philosophy, Kant didn't completely abandon the insights of sentimentalism.
He still saw value in its empirical observations about human behavior.
He acknowledged that sentimentalism could offer compelling explanations for how we actually make moral judgments in our everyday lives.
Even if it couldn't provide the ultimate justification for those judgments.
And he retained his earlier belief that certain feelings indicate a natural predisposition towards virtue, a kind of moral sensibility that's part of our human nature,
And we see this in his later works like The Metaphysics of Morals.
where he discusses feelings like moral feeling, conscience, love of humanity, and self-respect.
And he even argues that we have an indirect duty to cultivate those feelings.
Not because they're the foundation of morality, but because they can support our moral principles and actions.
Like they can help us to act in accordance with the moral law.
And he also acknowledges the value of sensibly grounded feelings like sympathy,
Because they can motivate us to care for others to promote their happiness.
which is itself a moral duty.
So there's a kind of tension in Kant's thinking.
A recognition of the power of feelings, even while insisting on the primacy of reason.
And this tension is even more apparent when we look at their views on the role of reason and emotion in morality.
Which is our next stop on this philosophical roller coaster ride.
Hold on tight, folks. It's about to get bumpy.
Now, as we've seen, Kant firmly elevates reason to the highest position in his ethical system.
It's the supreme moral authority, the ultimate guide for our actions.
And this is a direct and fundamental opposition to Hume's prioritization of feeling.
For Hume, passions rule the roost.
They're the driving force behind all our actions, including our moral ones.
And this disagreement profoundly shapes their accounts of both moral judgment and moral motivation.
But, as we've already discussed, the lingering influence of sentimentalism on Kant makes things a bit more complicated.
It adds layers, nuances, shades of gray.
Exactly. So let's start with moral judgment, the process by which we determine whether something is morally right or wrong.
How does Hume explain this process?
For Hume, it's all about detecting those virtuous or vicious mental qualities in ourselves and others.
Like recognizing kindness or cruelty, honesty or deceit?
And we do this through a peculiar feeling, a sentiment of approval or disapproval that arises within us when we contemplate those qualities.
It's like we have this built-in moral sense, this intuitive feeling for what's good and bad.
And while reason can help us to understand the consequences of actions, to see the bigger picture.
It's ultimately that feeling, that sentiment, that determines our moral judgment.
And it's not just any feeling. Hume is very specific about this. It needs to be a feeling that arises from a general point of view.
The perspective of an impartial observer, someone who's not personally invested in the situation.
He calls this the judicious spectator, someone who's able to see things clearly without bias.
So, for Hume, moral judgment is essentially an emotional response, but it's a response that's informed by reason and guided by this ideal of impartiality.
And Kant takes a very different approach.
He shifts the focus to the agent, to the person who's making the moral decision.
And he's not so much interested in their feelings as in the principles that are guiding their actions.
The maxims, as he calls them, the underlying rules or intentions that shape our choices.
And the key question for Kant is whether those maxims can be universalized.
Whether they can be consistently willed as a law that everyone should follow.
And this is where his famous categorical imperative comes in.
The supreme principle of morality, the ultimate test for any action.
And reason, for Kant, is the tool we use to apply that test to see if our maxims pass muster.
So it's much more of a rational process for Kant, a matter of applying principles and testing our actions against those principles.
And he provides two main formulations of the categorical imperative to help us do this.
The formula of universal law, which says we should only act on maxims that we can will to be a universal law.
And the formula of the end in itself, which says we should always treat humanity, in ourselves and others, as an end in itself, never merely as a means.
So it almost sounds like a purely logical procedure for Kant. Identify your maxim, apply the categorical imperative, and reason will tell you whether the action is morally permissible.
And some readings of Kant do emphasize that kind of formal, rule-based approach.
But it's important to remember that Kant himself believed that applying the categorical imperative in the real world is a bit more complex than that.
He recognized that we need what he called principles of application, drawn from our empirical knowledge of human nature and the world around us.
Like, we need to understand the specifics of the situation, the likely consequences of our actions, to make informed moral judgments.
And he also emphasized the role of judgment, a kind of practical wisdom that can't be reduced to a set of rules.
Like knowing how to apply those general principles in the messy complexities of real life.
And the very existence of casuistry, the study of specific moral cases, underscores this point.
It shows that applying moral principles isn't always straightforward.
And Kant even argued that certain duties, what he called wider duties, allow for more individual judgment in their application.
Like there's room for interpretation, for taking into account the particularities of the situation.
So even within Kant's rational framework, there's a recognition of the need for practical wisdom, for sensitivity to the complexities of human interaction.
And he even acknowledges the importance of emotional sensitivity in certain contexts.
Like recognizing genuine kindness from condescension, or knowing when teasing crosses the line into mockery.
Those require a kind of emotional intelligence and awareness of social cues.
But the key point is that, for Kant, reason is always the ultimate authority,
It's the final arbiter of what's morally right or wrong.
while Hume unequivocally places feeling in that position.
So they fundamentally disagree on the source of moral authority.
And this disagreement carries over into their views on moral motivation, what actually drives us to act morally.
Hume, of course, is famous for his claim that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions.
Right, he's very clear on this point. Reason alone can never motivate us to act.
It's our desires, our emotions that provide the fuel for action.
And reason's role is simply to guide those passions, to help us achieve what we desire.
Like a map that helps us navigate, but doesn't determine the destination.
He even argues that passions, as original existences, can't be deemed contrary to reason or truth.
Like they're the primary data of our experience, the building blocks of our mental life.
And morality, for Hume, is no different. It's ultimately about exciting those passions, those feelings of approval and disapproval that then lead us to act in certain ways.
So any inclination we have to be moral, any desire to do good, must stem from some underlying feeling.
And Kant completely rejects this view.
He argues that pure reason can, in fact, motivate us to act.
He rejects the idea of reason's motivational impotence.
Like reason isn't just a passive observer, it can actively shape our will.
And he believes that genuinely right actions, those with true moral worth, don't require any emotional prompting.
It's the recognition of our duty, of the moral law that compels us to act.
And this is where his concept of respect comes in.
That feeling of awe, of reverence for the moral law.
It's not just a passion, it's a feeling that's self-wrought by a rational concept.
Like it arises from our understanding of the moral law, from our recognition of its authority.
And it's this feeling of respect that can bridge the gap between reason and action, that can motivate us to do our duty, even when it's difficult.
So it's a kind of moral feeling, but it's a feeling that's rooted in reason, not in inclination or desire.
And there's some debate among Kant scholars about the exact nature of this feeling of respect.
Whether it's simply an effect of reason on our sensibilities, or whether it's actually the cause of our moral motivation.
Like, does reason produce the feeling of respect, which then motivates us? Or is it the feeling of respect itself that arises from reason and drives us to act?
It's a subtle distinction, but an important one for understanding Kant's theory.
And we shouldn't forget that Kant doesn't completely disregard other moral feelings.
Like he discusses moral feeling, conscience, love of humanity, and self-respect in the metaphysics of morals.
And he even argues that we have a duty to cultivate those feelings.
Not because they're the foundation of morality, but because they can support our moral lives, make us more receptive to the demands of duty.
And he also acknowledges the moral value of sensibly grounded feelings. like sympathy, because they can lead us to care for others, to promote their happiness.
So both Kant and Hume, in their own ways, recognize the role of feeling in moral motivation, especially in the development of virtue.
But the crucial difference is that Kant believes pure reason can produce a motivationally efficacious feeling, that feeling of respect.
Something that Hume would likely deny.
And they also differ on the moral worth of actions done solely from duty.
Kant sees those as the only actions with true moral worth, because they're motivated by respect for the moral law itself.
While Hume might be more skeptical, seeing such actions as potentially indicating a lack of natural affection or sympathy.
Like maybe the person is just doing their duty out of a sense of obligation, not out of any genuine care for others.
Which brings us to their differing conceptions of virtue and vice, another key area of disagreement.
Both of them see virtue and vice as central to morality, but they define them very differently.
And their lists of what counts as a virtue or a vice also diverge significantly.
So let's start with Hume. How does he define virtue?
For Hume, a virtue is simply a character trait that elicits a pleasing sentiment of approbation in a spectator who is observing with a judicious and impartial perspective.
It's all about how others perceive us, whether our character traits evoke positive feelings.
Even something like prudence, which we might think of as more of a practical skill than a moral virtue, is considered a virtue by Hume because it tends to please a judicious observer.
Like it shows foresight, planning, a concern for one's own well-being.
And that's seen as admirable, as something to be praised.
So for Hume, it's external approval that defines a virtue, not some inherent quality of the trait itself.
And Kant takes a very different approach.
He's much more focused on the internal disposition of the ager, on the motives and intentions behind their actions.
He defines virtue as the cultivated capacity and firm resolve to resist the influence of our inclinations and consistently fulfill our duties out of respect for the moral law.
It's about having the strength of will to do what's right, even when it's difficult, even when we'd rather do something else.
It's about mastering our desires, our impulses, and submitting ourselves to the authority of reason.
And this involves developing a disposition towards duty, having a consistent commitment to acting morally.
And it requires moral strength, the ability to overcome the radical evil of prioritizing self-love over the moral law.
So for Kant, virtue is about internal struggle, about aligning our will with the moral law, not about seeking external approval.
And this difference in their definitions of virtue is reflected in the respective catalogs of virtues and vices.
Let's take a look at Hume's list first.
Hume divides virtues into two categories, natural and artificial.
What's the difference?
Natural virtues are those that are naturally pleasing or useful, independent of any social conventions or agreements.
Like kindness, generosity, courage.
Those traits tend to be admired and valued across cultures and historical periods.
And artificial virtues are those that depend on social conventions, on rules and institutions, like justice, honesty, promise-keeping.
Those are virtues that are essential for maintaining social order, for a functioning society.
But they're not necessarily natural in the sense that they don't always align with our immediate inclinations.
Sometimes we might be tempted to break a promise or cheat someone, even if we know it's wrong.
So artificial virtues require a kind of self-restraint, a willingness to follow the rules, even when it's not easy.
And these artificial virtues pose a particular challenge for Hume's system.
How so?
Because his whole theory of morality is based on the idea that we're motivated by feelings of approval and disapproval.
But why would we approve of actions that go against our natural inclinations?
Hume's answer is that we recognize the long-term benefits of following these rules.
Like a society where everyone keeps their promises and respects property rights is ultimately a more stable and prosperous society.
So even though following these rules might sometimes feel unpleasant in the short term, we ultimately approve of them because we see their value in the long run.
It's a kind of enlightened self-interest.
Exactly. We see that it's in our best interest to live in a society where these virtues are upheld, even if it means sometimes sacrificing our immediate desires.
And Hume's list of natural virtues is quite extensive. It includes traits like benevolence, prudence, temperance, courage, and even wit and good manners.
He also categorizes virtues based on their usefulness to oneself or to others and their immediate agreeableness.
So some virtues are more self-regarding, focused on our own well-being.
While others are more other-regarding, focused on the well-being of others.
And some virtues are immediately pleasing, while others might require more effort or sacrifice.
It's a very nuanced and detailed catalog reflecting Hume's deep understanding of human nature.
Now, Kant's approach to classifying virtues is much more structured.
It's tied to his system of duties derived from the categorical imperative.
So every virtue, for Kant, corresponds to a specific duty.
And those duties are themselves grounded in the supreme principle of morality, the idea that we should act only on maxims that we can will to be a universal law.
So the first step is to identify those duties that can be derived from that principle.
And then we can identify the corresponding virtues, the character traits that enable us to fulfill those duties.
And Kant outlines both perfect and imperfect duties.
Perfect duties are those that admit of no exceptions, they're absolute obligations.
Like the duty not to lie or kill.
And imperfect duties are those that allow for some degree of discretion in how we fulfill them.
Like the duty to help others or to develop our talents.
We have some leeway in deciding when, how, and to whom we extend our help, or how we choose to develop our talents.
And Kant further divides duties into duties to oneself and duties to others.
So we have perfect and imperfect duties to ourselves, and perfect and imperfect duties to others.
And for each of these duties, there's a corresponding virtue.
For example, the virtue of honesty corresponds to the perfect duty not to lie. The virtue of beneficence corresponds to the imperfect duty to help others, and so on.
So Kant's catalog of virtues is very systematic, very organized around his ethical framework.
And it's worth noting that he draws on his understanding of human nature to specify the content of these duties.
Like he recognizes that we have certain natural inclinations, certain needs and desires.
And he takes those into account when formulating his ethical principles.
So it's not a purely abstract system. It's grounded in a realistic view of human beings.
And despite their very different approaches, there are some points of convergence between Hume and Kant on the topic of virtue.
What are some of those areas of agreement?
Well, they both agree that virtue is central to morality, that it's essential for a flourishing moral life.
And they both reject psychological egoism.
The idea that all human actions are ultimately motivated by self-interest.
So they both believe that we're capable of genuine altruism, of acting for the good of others without any ulterior motive.
And they also both accept some version of the distinction between perfect and imperfect duties.
Though they might categorize specific duties differently.
And their general conception of virtue is largely secular, without a primary emphasis on religious virtues or duties.
But despite